what I'm trying to do here with this presentation is, first of all, give you a flavor of the benefit that a whole community derives from adopting an open development model. And they started very early on doing it. And second of all, give you a flavor of the various kinds of evolution paths that the community codes have taken in this community and other communities. And I would like you to take away from this to think about whether your community is amenable to such development, and what would it take for you to build a community around one or a suite of codes that would then be usable by a large number of people within your research community. So I would like to acknowledge that some of the slides come from Brian O'Shea, who is associated with the Enzo effort, and some more from Matt Turk, who is actually evangelizing this process of community development even more strongly than I am. So the astrophysics community on its own had an early culture of releasing research software. It started with the N-body codes that came out in N-body 1 and went up all the way to N-body X. And roughly at around the same time, and this is in the mid to late 80s, that also the Barnes-Hut tree code came out. And then Mike Norman and Jim Stone released Zeus 2D, which also included the hydrodynamics capability. And even though they were not, they were just the code that was available, it did not come with any of the other supporting infrastructure, such as a lot of documentation and user support, et cetera, but the code was available for people to get started. And that also later was released as Zeus 3D. And in the 90s, late 90s and early 2000s, there were SPH codes such as Hydra and Gadget that began to appear. For all of these codes, so in the later versions of Astro codes, many a times you find a core seed that came from one of these early codes, and some of them have been completely new developments. But what I'm trying to say is that one community code started, and then it kept on morphing and kept on becoming more and more sophisticated as the needs of the community grew. So the adaptive mesh refinement appeared for the first time I think the first release of Flash in 2000, and now vast majority of the mesh-based methods used in astrophysics community use AMR in some form or the other. And then also, at around the same time, shock capturing, magnetohydrodynamics, and radiation hydro started to appear in various codes. And this tradition of open development has continued with many more codes appearing over the years. Some codes have taken the trouble to develop a structured approach to their infrastructure so that they have become extensible and capable, so that people can take them, add the specific capability they need in order to customize the code for their use. And some of these capabilities make their way back into the code and get included in the release so that the overall release becomes more capable. There is even a website that maintains a very comprehensive list of available open source codes in astrophysics, and that's the URL for it. They not only just have the specific astro codes, but they also give you links to the useful libraries that are used heavily in astro codes, for example, FFTW, which is very heavily used, etc. So this is anybody, and in fact, I suspect that this website is going to be useful not just for people doing astro, it's going to be useful for almost everybody, because it really is a very comprehensive list of usable libraries and codes and has links to home pages. So in the astrophysics community, what ended up happening was most of the codes that became public started out as a research software that somebody wanted to use for their own purposes, and then they decided that the code would be useful for others, and they released them. Some codes achieved a great degree of sophistication before they were released to public, and that was the model followed by Enzo, whereas in codes like Flash, from day one, it was known that code was going to be released as soon as it achieved a reasonable degree of stability, and as long as it wasn't going to embarrass its developers once it was released, right? So And then with the arrival of YT, there is yet another paradigm shift, and this is that, so YT is an analysis and visualization package. From the very beginning, their motto was they were building the community, and they were building a community code for the community, involving the entire community in the development process. So they instituted the methodologies for communication and code contribution, etc., from the get-go, and that's basically is the effort that's led by Matt Turk, and like I said, he's become a true evangelist for the cause of community development. So the question is, why did community codes flourish in astrophysics? Or actually, there is a connected question that's even more important, is why do some communities adopt open source models while others do not and are suspicious of it? And I think the basic answer lies in the minimum set of capabilities that a community requires in order to make any scientific progress. So astrophysics problems need multi-physics, multi-scale to make any sort of advancement, because you're trying to simulate supernova, then you need to have a compressible hydrodynamics, you need to have a very specialized equation of state, you need to handle various material properties, you need to have nuclear reactions in there, et cetera, and it's impossible for any one group of people to do it. So what I've done here is I've given you a broad classification of the different kinds of methods that are typically in use in the astrophysics community. There are mesh methods, which are usually the gas dynamic part of it is usually modeled explicitly with it's a Euler's equations of conservation laws. And then there is the implicit or you can get away with using semi-implicit methods for computing the gravitational potential, and usually you have self-gravity in these calculations. And then when you get to the radiation, you need a fully implicit method in order to resolve those that phenomena properly. Then you use n-body or particle methods, and they can come in many flavors. They can come as tracers, which are just tracing the flow and are used for post-processing to, for example, when you're doing a supernova calculation, you use them to record the thermodynamic properties of the fluid at various points, and then you run it through a nuclear network in order to get the nucleosynthetic yield. So they are not influencing the dynamics of the calculation, but they're just observing it. And then you have other forms of particles that also influence the dynamics of the flow, and those are the massive particles which are used in cosmological simulations, the n-body method, and the charged particles, which is the PIC methods. And some people interchangeably use the name PIC for gravity as well as charge, right? And then almost all of them have what you call 1D calculations, which are pointwise calculations, and these are typically equations of states, the material properties, the source terms, etc. And anytime, or I should say most of the time, an astrophysics calculation is going to have a multi-scale, and it's going to have structures in limited parts, and therefore they almost always need to use AMR if they're using any mesh methods at all, because uniform discretization is just way too expensive for all of these calculations. And the pictures are basically a snapshot of the wide variety of calculations that are done in astrophysics that make use of these various capabilities. And so developing and maintaining such complex codes is really beyond the capabilities of individuals or even small groups. And I would say that even large-scale efforts have taken many, many years of development and later addition of capabilities in order to arrive at a point where they can model really complex physical phenomena with a reasonable amount of fidelity. And these models are still very far from perfect, which means that these codes are still going to be accreting more and more of capabilities in future. So, but what about the other communities? Why don't the other communities go to the open source model? And like I said, this approach, it's easier to sell it to communities that need multi-scale, multi-physics, right? And usually it takes somebody with the vision to see that developing code is, that distributing code is more beneficial than keeping it closely guarded for some wrongly perceived competitive advantage that many people still think is useful in many science areas. So what happens is a visionary will see this advantage and the code will become available to public, and then what happens is that a critical mass gets built and the sophistication in modeling advances far more rapidly in these communities because people can build on the work of others. And the communities that do not allow open mode, usually what ends up happening is that there is repeated reinvention of wheels. Like one of the worst communities in this regard is the CFD community. Everyone has their little codes, and they are stuck doing the same kind of computations over and over again. And the general advancement in any model fidelity is relatively slower in these communities. So I thought it would be a good exercise to sort of examine what does it take to build a community code and what does it take for a community to adopt a community code, right? So, there's a book by Raymond where he talks about the two development models, the Cathedral model and the Bazaar model. In the Cathedral model, the code is open. It's available. The entire source code is available to the users, but there is a gatekeeping being done by a close core group of people that are sort of exclusive, and these are the designated software developers. The control of the software is central. In the Bazaar model, the code is developed in view of public. Everyone can participate and contribute to the code, and Raymond credits Linus Torvalds for the inventor of this process. The control models here are also distributed. Scientific codes, by and large, still fall in the Cathedral model. And there are some good reasons and some bad reasons. One of the good reasons is that, not all science communities have been sold on the software process itself so far. And so for those communities to even think about a community code model is sort of hard. It's a hard sell. The bigger problem, and this is something that Enzo has encountered as it went from a closed source to an open source, is that some people, what happens is some of the developers are careful about maintaining the quality of the code, some others are not. And so there are versions of Enzo in circulation now that some scientists describe as producing crappy results. And it hurts the entire community. So that is a valid concern, and it's a concern that needs to be addressed carefully. Also, because the primary developers for the methods in the scientific codes tend to be the domain scientists. And for them, it's very hard to generate funding to do the development without also producing results simultaneously. So that sort of doesn't work too well for the Bazaar model if there is no core group of people developing the code. Also, in many of the science areas, the user community is too small to support the Bazaar model because what ends up happening is you need a little bit of a time here and a little bit of a time there from several users in order to have any code contribution go on in a Bazaar model. And if your community is too small, then the strain on everyone is too high. And like I said, like Catherine also pointed out, and I'm sure others have pointed out before, that the reward structure for doing this kind of necessary but not immediately useful work for publication, the reward structure just is not compatible with that kind of investment. And then there are the not so valid objections, and one of them is the codes are far too complex. The codes that have gone open and have started attracting contributions from people are as complex as any that are not public, and that hasn't hindered their growth. So that is just a specious argument. And the one that I particularly dislike is that, I don't want to release my code because this person is going to use my code and produce results before me. It's just a completely false argument, in my opinion. And the counter to that is...
Why do you think it's false?
Why do I think it is false? Because...
that seems to be valid to me in some sense. I'm not saying that it ethically is correct or not. I'm but it seems to be like a nice, a correct argument.
Because where do you draw the line for then when anytime you obtain a scientific result, you publish it and you expect others to build upon it, right? A code is just a tool. A code is not what your scientific idea is. So you use that code to advance the scientific idea. If you want that code, if you release the code, actually what happens is somebody else will use it for a different idea and it'll feed back into your own research, and your own research is much more likely to grow rapidly. And the second one is that if you don't publicize your code, how does anyone know that your results are believable?
Right, but I think there must be a distinction between the idea and the code that you actually promoted. So if what's important is the idea, then the code is just a manifestation of that idea. And if you come up with the next idea, then you just need to just improve the code. So people are usually, depends, we can talk after.
Yeah, this is an offline argument, but there was someone else with a raised hand.
That can be said similar to the experimental setup, where should the experimentalist make his experimental setup open to public where anybody can come and run the experiments?
But one differentiator, and this is especially true in the examples that Anshu was talking about, but I think it's globally true. That would apply if you had sort of a single-purpose code, right? That was designed to solve a particular problem in a very specific way, and had very little flexibility associated with what it could do, right? And so that I think is that I actually think is a sort of a different type of problem than when you're talking about codes that can solve a variety of problems in a variety of ways depending on how you actually configure what you'll run. So it's a different type of tool. It's kind of like developing a facility, like a photon source, versus developing, a specific lab, experiment. I'm guessing, in a specific lab, right? It's developing the tool in this case truly versus the.
There is this other. Well, I had this thought and I just lost it. You mean? Right, because I got it back. So the thing is that people do publish the method that went into the code, but they still won't publish the code, which means that strictly speaking, the intellectual content of that code is public already. Somebody who wants to take the trouble of implementing it can. But they just cannot do it fast enough because they don't already have the code. And that's perceived as the competitive advantage, which I think is silly.
It's neither black or white. There's
yeah.
both. But I think what you need actually is a community which encourages it. It's like free trade.
Yes.
Free trade is beneficial to everybody.
Yes.
But if one person doesn't play the game, then they can make marginal advantage. So there needs to be trade agreements to force people to have mutual advantage. So what you need is agencies and professional bodies and so on to see the larger picture.
Yes, and then there is the flip side to it. So this is an anecdote that one graduate student actually was using Flash for his research, and he developed a module on primordial chemistry, and then he wanted to contribute it back to Flash as early as possible because he thought that would increase his citation record. So there's that advantage of it. Anyway, but many times the resistance to turning a code into a community code is just the history of the development and the pride of ownership. People just don't want to release it. Having discussed this business of how scientific codes become public, they can follow several different paths for turning from a closed code to an open source, open community code. The most common path has been in the past that someone wrote a useful piece of code that people in the group started using, and then as people leave the group, they take the code with them and they add to the code, and if the relationships were still good between the group resident in the institution and the people that are leaving, then the close collaboration continues and the code base just keeps growing. And so once the critical mass of such users is achieved, the code, at this point in time, the code essentially becomes public because people start to share it with their new collaborators and so on, and the code's usage just grows. So in these situations, there is no focused effort on building the community or growing the code. It is just happening organically. And what may happen in these circumstances is, unless something changes, this code will have limited shelf life, because usually this is exactly what ends up being your typical spaghetti code. So a more sustained path to community code development then is that when you have this organically growing code, someone decides that some long-term planning might actually be useful, and so they take the trouble to better engineer the code, better architect the code. And so they actually design it, imposed some discipline, some design on the code base with some thought to extensibility and future code growth. So here now, as the code grows, so does the community-supported model. And this is a much more sustainable path by which the shelf life of the code is increased. This model is still relatively rare, though the occurrences are increasing. A desirable path, this is the wish list, which doesn't happen very often, and the funding agencies are going in exactly the wrong direction for this kind of a path growth, is that that there is explicit funding to build a code for the target community, which means that there is an implied support for the design phase, which means that you don't have to have a code that is producing results just as soon as it gets off the, starts going. So here, the outcome of that investment in the design phase is that you have a longer lasting and much better engineered code, which definitely has future growth and thoughts given to future growth and extensibility. And when this works, and it has worked in the past, because there was funding for this kind of effort in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so when this happens, many longer lasting codes and that are much more capable in the end have come out. So all of the dominant HPC, multiphysics, multi-scale codes of today can trace their beginnings to the time when this kind of funding was available, those being Flash, Cactus, Samurai, Chambo, NAMD, and so on and so forth, right? So the benefit of the open source code is then that if your community, the entire community is participating in developing the code, it's really hard to pull the plug on it. So even if your core funding goes away, you still have a critical mass of people that will keep supporting the code. Users have the source code they can use and modify it as much as they want. Users don't really have to, so this is not like the commercial model where users have to pay for the use of the code. They just pay with their time and their feedback into the development process. And for the people who are developing, and this goes to what Catherine was talking about, is that when users have stake in the survivability of the code or adding of the capability of the code, they talk to the funding agencies and convince the funding agencies to invest more into the code. And therefore, in that sense, the stakeholders are power. And as we have found through harsh experience, is that the number is not what counts. It's how vocal and important your stakeholders are to the critical path perceived by the funding agencies, which really counts. In the open source model, then there is a software engineering and process, and you will hear a lot more about it tomorrow. But the things that almost always need to happen are strong interfaces and encapsulation, because that is the only way that you have enough isolation between capabilities that different people can contribute without having to learn the entire code base. So users can customize the code in many different ways, and that depends somewhat on the code architecture. For example, in Fortran-based codes, you can add interfaces on top of the infrastructure. In C++-based code, you can use derived classes and so on. But there is always some form of customizability is built into them. And because the code is open source, they can localize their customization and therefore have more control over the process of customization. So we made this case that the scientific codes are primarily the Cathedral model, but then there are many benefits to the Bazaar model, which is why a few of the codes have moved from Cathedral to the Bazaar model. And the advantages is that in the Bazaar model, there are many more eyes that are looking at the code in the early stages of its development, which means that there are many more beta testers. And so the problems are characterized much more quickly. The bugs are found much more quickly. And because there are many more people looking at the same code base, the solutions and more elegant solutions are likely to occur to people because people come with different thought processes to this process. So there are more varied test cases that demonstrate bugs, and the debugging is effectively parallelized because many different people are exercising different parts of the code. The capability addition is rapid, and you can get codes that can do more, that can model more phenomena. But the basic necessity is a good extensible design, because all the users, it doesn't matter how many capabilities you added to the code, a new user comes along, and it's almost always true that that user wants something different from what is already there in the code, and therefore needs the customization in a slightly different way. But some of the strengths of the Bazaar model are also the pitfalls of the Bazaar model, because there is, when you have a bigger knowledge pool, that also means more conflicting opinions, so it is much harder to converge on the direction in which the code is going and what ought to be the next capability added to the code. So the prioritization becomes extremely challenging, and if there is a need for any fundamental infrastructural changes, as for example, many of these codes are facing these days because of the hardware paradigm shift, then getting any sort of consensus or a path forward for fundamental changes to these codes can become a near impossibility. Gatekeeping is, in order to maintain the software quality, can be a huge challenge. And because the scientific codes have their own peculiarities, their verification and validation can become challenging, and orchestration of capability combination is harder because there is physics with very conflicting requirements, and what is an optimal data layout for one physics might not be an optimal data layout for another physics, and therefore you need to pay attention to where your trade-offs are and how do you want that design to go. So all of that becomes, it's hard enough to do when you're doing it in a core group of people, because it is fundamentally a challenging problem, and you mix in conflicting opinions and people with different agendas, and this becomes a really hard problem to solve. So. And then there are other considerations in that when you have a community code, your users come in many different categories. So there are novice users that will just take your application, take one of the example applications, run it by changing the parameters, and that's adequate for their purposes. Most users, though, fall in the second category, where they will generate new problems. So they want to analyze them. So what they want to do is they want to take the basic solvers, the components of your code, apply different initial conditions, maybe apply different boundary conditions, write alternative and or derived functions for specialized output, and they're good to go. Then there are the advanced users that customize existing functions for their own use, and then there's a very small group of expert users that then branch off into new research and therefore are bringing in completely new capabilities into the code, and sometimes they also force rethinking the infrastructural aspects of the code. And so they can contribute to the core functionality. So in order to address all of these users, then you need to have things like a good distribution policy and a good contribution policy. In distribution policies, you have to think about how restrictive do you want the licensing agreement to be, and this goes back to gatekeeping in the sense that do you want your code to be freely distributed to anybody, but then you have many different versions existing and you have no quality control and the corresponding pitfalls. Then, so in terms of distribution, so you worry about who can get the code and should there be registration requirements, and if anyone entangles with things like AMR and hydrodynamics combined with the radiation, they come under the radar of various agencies in the US, and you start getting threatened with export control. So those are also the things that you have to worry about in your code capabilities. So you have to think about what can be included in the release and what is the degree of support for the released components, especially when you're getting code components from the external users. How much guarantee do you give? And then there is the question of how often to release, because a release is not a zero effort process. The release is when you do things like making sure that the coding standards are met, making sure that your documentation is up to date, making sure that the various portions of the code have been verified, even the codes that the core team is not using. So there is this overhead of releasing, and the question of making the capabilities available to the user base as early as possible. And then in the contribution policies, you have to worry about balancing the needs for the code contributors and the code distributors, because people would want the contributors sometimes want some period of time over which they don't want their code released yet, but they want it integrated into the code base so that it is supported and integrated. And so you have to figure out the policies by which you're going to allow this to happen in your code. The minimum things that you need from a contributor, for example, and right now I've gone back to talking about the Cathedral model, where the gatekeeping is done by a core group of people, is that what you need is the source code. You need whatever build scripts are necessary in order to integrate that code into the base source base of the host code. And you definitely need tests so that you can verify the correctness of it on an ongoing basis, and you need documentation from users. You need to get an agreement on user support from the code contributors. If you have a certain standard of user support, you need to make sure that these contributors are agreeing to providing at least the same level of user support, if not more. Or there is an option whereby you can say that this code, this particular component of code works with the host code seamlessly, but it is not supported by the core, under the core release of the code, that it is supported by the people who are releasing it. And then there is a clear delineation between what is the core release and what is the add-on. So all these are the various options that different groups work with differently. Now going on to the community building. So what the collective experience of people, and I've been associated with at least 2 efforts that have communities, and talking to in conversation with many other groups that have their community codes, that the popularization of the code alone does not build a community, because then people just take it and go, and they don't give back into the community, and therefore you don't have any advocates for your code. So just providing the capability, providing the customizability, et cetera, just is not enough. What you need is, in order for people to really feel involved, you need for them to be able to contribute back, and you should be encouraging the contribution from people. You should also not have very restrictive distribution policies. At least in one instance, the restrictive distribution policies were getting in the way of community development of the code. So you need to do a careful balance between the gatekeeping and ease of redistribution from various different groups. But bottom line is, more inclusivity you have in your community, the greater success in community building. But the first thing that needs to happen before a community building is an investment in robust and extensible infrastructure and a strong culture of user support. So I'll move on to now 3 examples: Flash, Enzo, and YT. So Flash was developed and distributed by one institution, and that was the University of Chicago under the Flash Center. It started out by having sustained funding under the ASC Alliance program. So this was a 5-year funding. And one of the mandates of this funding was that there was going to be a publicly released code for being able to do thermonuclear flashes that occur in astrophysics from the very beginning. So, and the same code was expected to be used for multiple different applications. It wasn't meant for just one specific application, which means that from the very beginning, the code needed to have certain amount of plug and play built into it. And all of the target applications were basically reactive flows. Now, within this and this was happening in 1998, 99 framework, when these kinds of developments were rare. The frameworks were just taking off. And here there were these two groups with their conflicting requirements. There was the group that wanted to produce a really well-architected modular code, and then there was the group that wanted to have a code that they could use for science almost right away. And there weren't enough resources to meet both the goals in the near term, so two parallel development paths started. There was a great deal of animosity between the two groups, and it was just bad, right? And in the beginning, in the end, it turns out that neither group was completely right, because all of the frameworks that went off and did their purely CS development sort of did their capability building depending upon an assumption of what the users are going to need, instead of really talking to the users in terms of what they're going to need. And Flash, on the other hand, basically sort of took the components it needed and smashed them together without a real thought to what the outcome was going to look like. So initially, Camp 2 won out, and 3 codes were taken, and they were fused together, and they were able to produce science. But then, when they wanted to add new capabilities, every time it needed tweaking the infrastructure. It just wasn't a sustainable path. So then, because the initial stuff was just smashing of the codes together, it actually took 3 iterations of code refactoring to finally get a robust infrastructure built. And the final one, the one that is in the most modern version of Flash, the developers were left alone to do the design for nearly a year. And that's the critical point, is that because at this point in time, scientists had a working code, right? So they weren't breathing down your neck all the time that I need this code working tomorrow. And they had seen the advantage of being able to add components without having to deal with an incomplete infrastructural architecture. And so they were willing to let the developers alone, and they were willing to work with the developers in terms of giving their insights and feedbacks and helping develop the tests that would make sure that the code was robust, et cetera, et cetera. But it still took, so as I said, you do need, but the reason why this 3rd iteration worked out was because by this time, the developers had been working with the scientists long enough that they had internalized the pitfalls, the things where the design could go wrong. They knew what was needed, and they sort of understood what was needed much better than all of these codes that had started in isolation from the user community. So this was an important lesson in that you really need a tight coupling between the users and the developers, and you need at least one iteration where you let the scientists get a bad code working first and then unwind and untangle and get a better code out of it. So Flash was originally designed for thermonuclear flashes, and then as people wanted to do more things with it, because the thing that happened was you got the code for thermonuclear abilities, but it also had a mesh management with adaptive mesh refinement. It handled I/O for you. It handled the runtime environment building and runtime parameter inputs for you. So this became attractive for others who didn't just need these capabilities, but needed other capabilities also. So they started adding things like n-body problem on top of Flash's infrastructure. And then, over the years, many more physical capabilities got added because the architecture turned into a well-encapsulated modules that are interoperating with each other. And now, it serves many communities in astrophysics, but it also serves high-energy density physics, which is the laser experiments, and CFD with fluid structure interactions, where it made use of the infrastructure and added necessary physics capabilities. This is a poster child for how a really good investment in infrastructure can result in side benefits that were not foreseen when this code was originally built. So at the moment, its most rapid increases in modeling laser experiments because that community had no open code to start with. And it required very little modification to the basic infrastructure in order to accommodate these capabilities. It literally just took a matter of few months of adding physics modules for Flash to go from being primarily an astrophysics code to becoming an HEDP community code. The other part of it was some capabilities like radiation hydro got added as a part of radiation hydro, and particle tracing, ray tracing got added into Flash as a part of HEDP experiments. And the Astro community found that those capabilities were useful for them. So, we started, so the process of adding capabilities became very synergistic for the two communities. So here are some of the statistics for Flash. The releases happen roughly every 6 to 8 months. It's in version 4.x now. If you go to the Flash website, you will see that there are 857 papers listed on that site that have used Flash for partial or all of their results. The core team is now really, really small. It's just about 4 people, including the people who are running the simulations. It's increasingly more sophisticated. Contributions are coming from outside the core group. Some important examples being sync particles for star formation, incompressible Navier-Stokes primordial chemistry, et cetera, and the users list has become more openly, it has always been this way that actually other users answer the user questions much faster than the core developers of the center do. So in that sense, it has become a user-supported community. So it's moving towards the Bazaar model, but not quite, because the gatekeeping is still central. The releases are still centrally done by Flash. The nod to the Bazaar model are the add-ons. The building of the community took several years. I think the first time that it was determined that there were 100+ users outside of the Flash Center was, I think, about 8 years after the code had originally been released. And then it just took off. Then the number of users just grew exponentially. The community building originally started by enabling positive interactions between the developers and the center scientists. And then slowly the center scientists also drank the Kool-Aid of having a good software process and a good rigorous verification testing every day. And so almost everybody that went from the Flash Center out to other places also built their own, for example, regression testing framework. As the first thing they did, they claimed that they would not work without that anywhere anymore. And then we started to conduct tutorials on site and at major conferences so that more people could could be convinced about using the code instead of reinventing the wheel and starting from scratch. Easy customizability helped. Increasing capability helped because people could do higher fidelity modeling. But the greatest impact in popularizing the code was through, because there was a quick start guide that you can download the code. You have very few dependencies. There is a quick start guide, and there are enough range of included ready-to-go applications that you can just build something and start playing with the code almost immediately. As an interesting aside, one particular group of, there was a survey ran about the ways in which people were using codes, and there were some really interesting answers. So one of them was using it as a code for making students do modeling in a CFD class. Another person was using it as a tool for testing the I/O system, because if anything was wrong in the configuration, Flash would walk into it with all of its complexity and crash. So, most unexpected uses. And then there was one interesting one. He was using it to build sails on his boat so that his boat would go faster. I'm not kidding. This is true. And then the second example of community building is for Enzo, which transitioned from a completely closed to an even more open model than Flash. And some of it is dictated by necessity, and some of it is dictated by the arrival of Matt Turk in the community, I think. So it started as so the development from 1996 till 2003 was closed code, and then the first public release was in 2004. And then it has moved very close to a Bazaar model where there are 12 active developers distributed over 10 institutions. There are 25 contributors, more than 200 people on the Enzo users mailing list. And this is because Enzo did not ever have a centralized home where a group of people were working on it. And when it was a small enough code, a very few people could keep it going, but then it also acquired accreted capabilities, and it became impossible to manage. And then their funding got sliced. So now these various institutions, what they do is when they write a proposal for getting their science results, they make a provision for some development time from the scientist in each of those proposals. So it's this piecemeal collection of little bits of fundings from various institutions that combines into a whole for the development purposes, and that's why it has moved much more to the Bazaar model somewhat out of necessity. And then, of course, the complementary community of YT got built, and it adapted, even in its management policies, a distributed model. So now its development model is entirely distributed. There is a very small number of developers per institution, and it uses, I believe it uses Bitbucket or maybe GitHub, I'm not sure, but definitely a distributed version control system. And code forks and pull requests are used to move features and development branches to the main branch. Almost all of the discussion happens on archived public mailing list and on Google Docs. They also have about 1 to 2 workshops every year, which averages to about 1.5 workshop every year, where they have code sprints. And this is where they do the infrastructural projects and the more fundamental changes that need to happen to the code, not just small capability additions. So the outcome of this is that there is an enthusiastically and heavily involved user and developer community, because they all feel that they are direct stakeholders of this to the same extent in the code development effort. As Brian O'Shea likes to say, that most developers are astrophysics scratching their own itch. So in that sense, the capability contributions is very much in the model of anyone who's interested in adding whatever they want to. The challenges as is typical in the Bazaar model, because there is no leader, it's very hard to make major code revisions, especially if it requires the grunt work that has no reward system for it. And most of them are part-time developers. They all have their own scientific agendas, and therefore the boring but important infrastructure development work almost always comes last in their priority list. And this they are finding out is a really huge challenge in sustaining, especially with the monster that is the new hardware paradigm that is looming in horizon for everyone. And it takes a lot more work to build the consensus and keep the community together. So that was Enzo. The last one that I'm talking about is YT. YT is, in some sense, a simpler project in that it is not really trying to do physics. It is a visualization and analysis tool. But it started out by, so this is typically the title slide of what Matt Turk talks about, is that the YT project is not so much about building a visualization tool, but it is even more so about growing and engaging a community of practice. So to him, building a community has the technical as well as social aspects, and his view of scientific development traditionally has been that there are developers and there are users, and they do not overlap, and they fight with one another because the developers don't understand the users and the users don't understand the developers. In reality, most scientific development is actually that a subset of the users are really the developers, right? But in a community of practice, all the users need, in some sense, to be the developers. So which means that you get to use the tools for free, but in return you contribute by participating in the development process of the software. And his theme is that what you want to do is you want to foster a community of peers and not a community of elites, which means that no one really can say, I own the code. If you want to add anything to the code, you need my permission. Or what is typically, the instinctive reaction is if you've been working with a piece of code for a while and someone comes in with an alternative suggestion, the first thing you do is you look at it with suspicion. And you say, no, it is this way because it works well this way. But you need to question that assumption because people come in with different ideas, and you cannot right off the bat assume that any idea that's coming your way is bad because it's different from your idea. And their interactions are online, but they can be almost immediate. Here are a couple of snapshots of what they mean by immediate, in the sense that they use chat rooms, they use video conferencing, they use screen sharing, et cetera, for evolving the work. And this is what your typical, this is what the YT homepage looks like, is that it's, your major topics are home, community. So it almost comes before actually being able to get the code is what is the community. It just says it out there that that's more important for them. And this is about 1.5 years old at this time, but this is the statistics of what YT achieved within a couple of years of development. And as you can see, the code started out by being small, and then it's been growing, and the summary of activity, etc. So the lessons to be learned from all of these, the common threads, all of these codes have open source in a slightly, restrictive sense of open source, in the sense that Enzo and YT are completely open source. Flash is not closed source in the sense that the source code is completely available, but it has more restrictions on distributions because of its history. But they all have a governance structure in place. They all work on building trust among teams, and they have commitment to transparent communications, which means that it's not that some people have a privileged communication and some others don't. It's even across the board. They all have strong commitment to user support. And here is an important one. They either have an interdisciplinary team working on the project, or they have a group of people that are comfortable wearing different hats at different times. So they can be scientists and developers at the same time. All the codes pay attention to software engineering and documentation, and they understand the benefit of sharing as opposed to being secretive about the code. The general impact of the community codes distribution and the culture of having community codes in the astrophysics has been that scientists can focus on developing for their algorithmic needs instead of wasting a lot of their time developing the infrastructure such as mesh, particles, I/O, runtime environment, build systems, porting the code to new platforms, et cetera, et cetera. They can just focus on what is exactly their own need. A typical graduate student coming into astrophysics or into these groups that have these codes does not start out by thinking, this is what I need to start developing. The student would start out by thinking, this is the problem I want to solve. Let me look at this suite of codes that are available and see which one better fits my needs and which one I can customize for my own purposes. The student would start with that code and then build upon it and customize it. Now, this is not to say, and one of the objections that some people make to the community model of the code is it can foster idiot science, in the sense that people take the code and they use it without necessarily understanding the methods that they are using and therefore produce bad results. And this is it's an important question that requires this guidance, is that it should never be acceptable to treat a scientific code like a black box. It just isn't. A scientific code needs to be, you need to be able to understand what you're doing. You need to know at a high level what that method is trying to do. And then you need to use it in the ways that is consistent with the ways in which that method is meant to be used. The other question of how do you depend upon the results, it does not arise in community codes as much, because typically every component that is a part of a community released code has been exercised in many different ways by many different people. That's not to say that it is a comprehensive testing, but it is still much more likely to be more robust and more correct than a code that a graduate student is likely to develop, because that code is going to be exercised in much more limited way. So in this sense, these codes are more reliable and robust. So to continue with the idea of general impact of these codes, the researchers can build upon the work of others and get further faster. There is code component reuse in there. They do not need to become, if they have a multiphysics problem, each one requires a different numerical technique. They just need to broadly understand those numerical techniques. In order to implement every numerical technique, you really need to become an expert in that. They don't need to do that. They can rely upon expertise of others and make use of these codes. So, and the results are much more reliable. Because every new implementation, even in a public version, takes several years to iron out all the deficiencies and bugs. Because a code is only as good as the tests that are used to stress it, right? And also, when you use open codes for obtaining science results, these are more reproducible results. They stand up to scrutiny much more, and generally increase the degree of credibility of the research within that science domain. So in astrophysics, the involvement in these communities has affected the young science career trajectories. They have produced more significant and far-reaching advances in their field because they could save so much of their time by being able to reuse other people's efforts. Almost all of them have understood the importance of rigorous verification and validation process, and they take that culture with you, and therefore, in general, the credibility of results becomes better. And then there are the unexpected side benefits that happen from such communities. For example, the arrival of YT has actually spurred development in Enzo because that became a much easier tool for visualization and analysis purposes. Many more people were attracted to Enzo, and they started doing their own customization and feeding it back into the code base. Flash, for example, as I said earlier, morphed into community code for areas that had very little to do with its original target. And the new developments help back the Astro community also. So you have these, if investment has happened in building really solid, robust infrastructure and a good community, there are many benefits that occur in that community and beyond. So in conclusion, there are many reasons why community codes should be encouraged. It's because, in general, there is skepticism about the results obtained out of computation in science and engineering communities, and they need more scrutiny into their methods and software, which is why also I'm a very strong advocate of you opening your code as opposed to keeping it closed. There is no need to reinvent the wheels. And the other one is that scientists aren't really trained to write codes that are good, maintainable, and performant software. So if there are people in the team that are working with them that are trained into doing this, then you basically get better code that will work across many different classes of architectures. So a really ideal solution is to let the professionals do the software design and engineering with a lot of input from the target community. And ideally, some of the users will also be the developers. So I'll leave you with this thought that culture self-propagates, so it must be seeded directly. So you want to build a community, you must think about if you think about a community code, you must think about the kind of community you want to build. And then here is the other thought, this is the quote, that it seems likely that significant software contributions to existing scientific software projects are not likely to be rewarded through the traditional reputation economy of science. Together, these factors provide a reason to expect the overproduction of independent scientific software packages and the underproduction of collaborative projects in which later academics build on the work of earlier ones. This is the challenge we have, is to get past this, that this should not be the prevailing practice, it should be the other way around.
So at the beginning you spoke that there needs to be a visionary that will, for some communities, that will take on the task of sort of opening the source code. But from what you're saying, it seems that's a lot of investment into there may not, if no one uses your well-developed, lot of thought community code, then you may have wasted a year of your life developing something that was supposed to be used by the community, and then it happens not for whatever reasons. Maybe,
yes.
Right?
So when I mentioned the visionary, it wasn't that there needs to be a visionary. Usually what has happened in the communities that acquired open source was that there was a visionary. And it is possible that there were other visionaries that we know nothing about because their work did not take off. So it's sort of important not to go off on your own and try to build a community code. First you build the community. You get the community to agree. And then you have a visionary that can put this community behind an effort whereby you build your community code. Or you can get lucky and somebody might fund it for you to develop it, in which case, and that's what happened to Flash, right, is that it was funded to build a community code, but then it took several years of focused effort in order to build the community.
But we find, especially in my area of material science, that this proliferation of idiot science occurs when codes are not well documented, or their methods are not well documented.
It's probably true, but idiot science can happen despite really well documented codes also. There will always be people who are too lazy to do their homework appropriately. But yes, no, I am a very strong supporter of documentation. In fact, when I used to run the Flash code group for a very long time. And we had, you had users guide, you had developers guide, but even more importantly, there was part of the coding standard was the amount of inline documentation you had to have in every single piece of routine you wrote. And the reason for that is people move. In an academic setting, your developer population is transitional. So people come and go. If your code is not documented, it's going to die in no time because no one will know how to maintain it. But if your code is very well documented, even if that particular expertise is not there, the general expertise in the group is enough to usually be able to maintain the code. So it was, before a release, we would run scripts that would go through all the routines and verify that there was adequate documentation in every one of those routines. And when it wasn't, people were made to do it. Yeah?
What kind of licenses did you find work best for these kind of open source projects?
There isn't a single answer for it. Different groups tend to have different kinds of licenses. So I think, for example, so the two projects that I've been associated with Chombo, there is no such thing as a license. You just sign up, and so that there is a record that you asked for the code, and you get access to the appropriate branch within the repository, and then you have access to the code. Flash was much more restrictive because it's veering into it has always been skirting very close to possible export control. And so there is a customized licensing process for Flash. Other groups have different ways. Like I said, there's no answer.
One thing I'll say, and similarly, that there really is no global answer, but one thing we have found at the facilities, there's a lot of good reasons to have the GPL license, say, versus BSD license. BSD license is a little bit easier, when you're talking about scenarios where you might be collaborating with labs and vendors. The GPL license has some pretty tough restrictions about how anything done within the code, right, has to be GPL, and that occasionally is problematic. It's not You know,
Yeah.
it's occasionally problematic. It's not a criticism of the license. It's just problematic.
Yeah, I think something went wrong with the GPL licensing recently, because of which, for example, Apple stopped using any of the GNU in their source code, the Xcode also. So yeah, that's something's gone wrong with it.
We can work, like the labs, we found ways to work with it, but when we need to give a GPL code to a vendor, like for exploring a problem, that's a pain in the butt.
You talked about you gave some astrophysics examples of the code. At the time those developments were started, how many commercial codes were in existence for the astrophysics community?
I don't believe there were any.
So do you think, I mean, you gave an example of CFD community, which I know really bad about open sourcing things. Do you think, because CFD community over the decades have had commercial codes where the technology was implemented and made available to the users, what would be your advice to the CFD community to transition from where there are several commercial codes to an open source scenario?
I think so. I also participated in a workshop where there were manufacturers that use these commercial CFD codes for their production, and they're all hurting really badly, because as they're moving into the HPC for their simulations, these codes are just not delivering because none of them scale. And so even among the manufacturers, now they're trying to collaborate with the labs in order to get codes that are so that they're not dependent upon these vendors. So I think this is, eventually the necessity is going to force it on them. But one of the problems that happens with the CFD community is that in terms of their biggest complication is the mesh, because for the manufacturers, for example, because it's the geometry which is the most important thing for them. And so what they can possibly do is just take the library generation packages from the commercial world and then develop the physical abilities on themselves. But in general, I have made efforts to try to bring that community around the idea of open source, and that really is the community that wants the competitive advantage and keep everything hidden. I haven't yet come across people who are open to distributing their code.
But there are, just to comment on that, I mean, take OpenFOAM. That's a widely known CFD code that is used. Actually, in fact, even from Stanford, to take one along, so it's actually, yeah, so that's another open source code. And,
but it's I mean, I think there's a lot of industry who have, for example, we collaborate with some that have explored using some of the different open source alternatives. It's a very difficult shift for them, right? Because they have a very complicated workflow. And what I mean by workflow is not sort of, the workflow of data and everything like that, but it's sort of an internal, right, industrial workflow.
And it doesn't deliver the turnaround that they need.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, also, industry has this issue that they want accountability. They want to be able to go and sue somebody if the code's not delivering, right? So in fact, it's a hard sell.
It's your responsibility. I think the code mentions that it's your responsibility. Whatever data you get is not the fault of the code.
But I think it's still that comfort of having, paying somebody for support and doing it.
Yeah, it's a matter of, right, the code will run, not what the code will produce, but that the code will run. It will be supported, that their critical product is not going to disappear because the funding for this code you were depending upon disappeared. But even if it's, but that apart, even people who are doing, for example, turbulence simulations, which is no geometry, every one of them has their own code.
And they get the widely varying results.
Yes,
when they compare them.
Yes. And they have made efforts to get a community going, but I don't think they've gone anywhere much. So I really don't understand what prevents them from doing it. But also, In turbulence, at least, the basic model is simple, right? It's what you get out of that model is absolutely complex.
One other aspect I'll just mention too about the industrial side, and I think you mentioned it, but I'll just say it clearly, right, is that I'm not making a poke necessarily at the business models for the industrial codes, but even outside of fluids, they are very slow to change. So they don't scale, I can tell you that. And even when you have big money being thrown at them, sometimes the challenge to get them to scale is pretty substantial. We've been involved in several of these efforts. And so it's not like, go in and fix this routine. It's go in and re-architect. So the industrial code, so the commercial codes are a big problem. And even with, I would argue for people who want to use them, and people who want to use them as two black boxes, it doesn't tend to work. And on the, it's truly just commercial, like in-house codes, because there are so many restrictions, because of their requirements, they're also slow to change. So it's not quite the same reason model, but it's the same effect, right? So it takes months and months and years to make little changes.